All right, so hi everybody. Thank you for joining us, to all the attendees, as well as all our panelists today. For those that don't know me, my name is Joe Metner. I'm the president of the Student Government Association. So I'm happy to be joined today by Professor Kimball from the Political Science Department, Professor Manion from the Political Science Department, Professor Bagwell from the Political Science Department, and Professor Acsay from the History Department. So they're going to be here as our experts today. So I want to go ahead and pass it on to them, give them the floor to do some brief introductions, as well as give through their whatever they have to share to start. So take it away.
I think to start with, we just wanted to play a brief clip of the speech that occurred at the Capitol preceding the riots. So we all have a common context of what happened, and we're going to look at a few quick photographs, and then Professor Bagwell is going to talk to us about vocabulary and how we talk about this, and we'll go from there. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
A favorite term that all of you people really came up with. We will stop the steal. It's a pure theft in American history. Everybody knows it. That election, our election, was over at 10 o'clock in the evening. We're leading Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia by hundreds of thousands of votes. And then late in the evening or early in the morning, boom, these explosions of bullshit. And all of a sudden, add this amazing movement. Thank you. We're going to walk down and I'll be there with you. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless.
And then we have a few slides just to sort of set the scene of what happened that day. So first of all, it's important to know there were a lot of people present in the Capitol that day. It was a huge event. And there are so many images, I think, that are seared in all of our brains from what happened on the 6th, from Officer Goodman sort of allowing or luring rioters into chasing him, to police officers being overtaken by protesters. One of the images that also was striking to me was that the mob took media equipment, basically mobbed the media, took their equipment and destroyed it. I think that was a particularly stirring image. On this bottom right-hand image, you can see the person kind of yelling in the front has an Oath Keeper hat on, which I think we'll talk about some of the groups that were present on that day. And the racist imagery at our Capitol and in our Capitol building, having the Confederate flag flown there, the sweatshirt that was worn here, a noose. I think that these are images and they have stuck with us all, and that really question, I think we come away from this day thinking, who are we as America and who do we want to be as America? And when we see these things, I think we should ask those questions. And then another big question that has come out of the events on January 6th is, how might this have looked different if this crowd were people of color? And so we've seen lots of comparisons of police response and militarized response to Black Lives Matter protests versus to protests in Washington, D.C. and the resulting riots that happened. So these are some images from Minneapolis and Washington, D.C. on the bottom left corner and the top right corner and bottom right corner for Black Lives Matter protests. And then you can see the comparison of what happened on January 6th. So I think these are all some of the things that we're sorting through and that we're going to try to process a bit here today. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bagwell to talk about the vocabulary and how we think about this.
Thank you, Dr. Manion. Let me get this up. All right. So yeah, I just want to jump in and talk a little bit about what we should call this, because I've heard in the media, on social media, in discussions with colleagues, people call it a lot of different things. An insurrection, which is fine. A coup, maybe, maybe not. Terrorism, a riot, a protest. There are a lot of different things we could call it, but all of these different terms have meanings. And just like a doctor trying to diagnose an illness, we can't talk about what causes it and what the consequences might be if we don't accurately identify what happened. So I just want to take a few minutes and do that. First, was it a coup? This was the first thing that I saw, especially on social media, people saying, Trump is trying to throw a coup, or these people are trying to throw a coup. And I want to give the definition and then talk about just very brief examples of what coups have looked like historically. A coup is a sudden violent overthrow of an existing government by a small group. Usually, pretty much always, the military and the police forces are part of this overthrow, which we didn't see that January 6th. There have been plenty of allegations coming out afterwards that there were retired military and maybe the Capitol Police were involved in some way in sort of allowing this to happen. But in terms of active involvement, we didn't see, tanks going through the streets, ushering Joe Biden out of town or anything else like that. So what I have pictures there is the coup in Mali, which you can clearly see, the Malian army driving through the capital on the way to the presidential quarters. And then the coup in Turkey historically has had a number of coups. This is the coup that then General Ataturk did with, again, the support of the military. So I don't think it was a coup. I don't think it was an attempted coup. I think that we have to look for other things to identify. And I don't think it was terrorism. I've seen the rioters or the protesters, the people who committed the violence, called terrorists. Terrorism we think of as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation against civilians in order to achieve political aims. So it sort of loosely fits under this, right? It was certainly the use of intimidation and violence against government officials, kind of in a weird civilian, non-civilian, borderline gray area. When I think of terrorism, I often think of like the Boston Marathon bombing, or obviously 9/11, or the Las Vegas shooting, or the Pulse nightclub shooting, right? These are terrorists usually try to maximize casualties for the lowest possible cost to themselves. And that's not really what happened at the Capitol. There were certainly some elements there that were looking to commit violence, but they weren't looking to just kill everyone or kill as many people as possible. So I don't think we can really accurately call it terrorism. There's a growing scholarly literature on election violence, which is just attempts to manipulate the process or outcomes of an election cycle through violence and intimidation. And I think if we look at examples of this from elsewhere in the world, this is exactly what this looks like, right? If we think throughout the process of how this happened in the US, there was this escalation that happened from November 6th to January 6th, where protesters show up outside of places where votes are being counted on the 7th and the 8th in Arizona and Nevada and elsewhere, demanding access and in some cases threatening violence, resisting police forces that are trying to keep them out of the rooms. And then January 6th, there's this rally, they're incited further, and then they storm the Capitol. But specifically, right, this is centered around the certification of the Electoral College votes. And that's clearly part of the electoral process and basically trying to overthrow the results of the election or overturn the results of the election. So what I have here, Kenya has historically had problems with election violence since they became democratic. There are peaceful protesters there marching for peaceful elections. And then in Nigeria, also experiences quite a bit of different political violence. The way election violence works there is local politicians will often recruit street gangs or militias to go out and intimidate, harass, or kill people that they believe are going to vote against them. And so that street sign is actually just a billboard that's in Nigeria trying to encourage people not to take money to commit election violence. So I think this is pretty clearly what this is election violence. And there were a number of scholars who warned about this, the US being more vulnerable to it beforehand, going back to September, October, as Trump was saying more and more things like the only way I'm going to lose is if there's fraud, and trying to sort of delegitimize the election before it even happened. So election violence has happened throughout history in the US, especially when new people are given suffrage or start to exercise their right to vote. And we see the same thing happening here. But why now specifically? We know that election violence is more likely to happen when an incumbent is running and they're uncertain about their prospects for victory. Incumbents are far more likely to commit or incite election violence than opposition politicians are. We know that election violence is more likely to happen when there are accusations of fraud or conspiracy theories, and we know that it's more likely to happen when militant activity increases. So I'll go ahead and stop now, and I'll turn over to Dr. Acsay.
Microphone here. Okay, thank you, Stephen, and I think it's a really good idea to define terms. And I'll just state at this point, as historians, I'm very leery on defining anything yet, because we really need information to come out day by day. As more information comes out, it's beginning, a puzzle is beginning to emerge from the pieces. But as you notice in my little reading or presentation, I'll just use mob. I use protest and mob, depending on which element we're talking about. But this is important. I'll also preface it by saying normally historians have a 30-year rule, waiting 30 years for archival materials to emerge to be able to characterize what took place. But I believe with the FBI and other investigative agencies, we'll have a very clear idea, probably 6 months or so, that we will really be able to put a accurate name on what took place. And quickly just mention, I know insurrection was used early on because insurrection is a specific word used in the Constitution that was leverage for bringing charges and for the indictment or the not hopeful, but the impeachment and then maybe removal of Trump. So there's very specific implications to using particular language. And also thanks, Joe, for inviting me. So I'll sort of bring up here and read a bit. If I can find what I have here. Oh my gosh, okay. So what I'm going to talk a bit about is, are our elections broken? And this is a course I've taught 2 semesters in a row, and of course, very interesting time to teach these courses. So are our elections broken? Well, The answer before January 6th was, while it may not be completely broken, 60% of Americans believed the Electoral College system should be replaced by the popular vote. There was no agreement on the precise system to replace the college, but among UMSL students who took my course in the last 2 semesters, 95% favored, quote, reforming or replacing the Electoral College, end quote. Students today are very well informed about the popular vote winner losing in 2000 and 2016. So there seems to be, a growing consensus that the winner of the popular vote should be the president, especially among younger voters. The Electoral College seen as an anachronism. However, the events of January 6th provided an entirely new and unprecedented critique of the presidential election system, not focusing on the flaws of the Electoral College, but centered on the notion that thousands or millions of Trump votes were somehow discarded, lost, or suppressed, and thousands or millions of Biden votes were fabricated or fraudulently cast. One problem with this critique is that it is lacking in specificity or in agreement among its supporters. The protesters, some of whom became a mob and tried to in some way interfere with or overturn the findings of the Electoral College, believe that the secretaries of state in a number of states, most of them under Republican control, by omission or commission, participated in this massive fraud, and that numerous state courts were unable or unwilling to uncover this massive voter fraud. The protesters, I lost my place here. Hold on a second here. The protesters, some of whom became a mob and tried to, most of them control, participated in the massive fraud, and that numerous protester mobbers were, to their mind, acting in the name of justice and trying to counteract the activities of some sort of conspiracy against Trump and his supporters. The protesters and mob did not agree on the precise nature of the conspiracy against Trump and those who want to make America great again, but it certainly was the so-called deep state popularized by Trump and apparently included Republicans in Georgia and Vice President Pence, as was mentioned. And later on, I hope some of the political scientists would talk about the origin of deep state, not something I was familiar with until recently, that phrase. This conspiratorial thinking is nothing new to the United States or to democracies worldwide. There was a long list from American history of those dark, hidden, and cloaked forces conspiring against the public good and democracy. In the early 19th century, threats came from the secretive Freemasons, as well as the Vatican and the Pope, who secretly controlled his immigrant American followers and had them vote in particular ways. And was mentioned about political violence. Almost all 19th century anti-immigrant violence is associated with voting days and the fear that immigrants are voting en bloc and they shouldn't be allowed to vote, depending on the state's provisions for citizenship. Later on, of course, the slave power conspiracy, was thought to have, by Northerners, thought to gain control of the federal government, and it imposed its views on the larger population North. And of course, as far as the South was concerned, the abolitionists, financed by the Secret Six, they're the ones who brought on an unnecessary civil war. And there were, of course, real conspiracies to assassinate President Lincoln. After the Civil War, it was railroads, corporation, trusts, and Wall Street financiers, ably represented by J.P. Morgan, who ran the government behind the scenes. The Federal Reserve was and is seen by some as a product of a conspiracy led by Paul Warburg, a financier and part of a, quote, world Zionist conspiracy, end quote. For many, the Pearl Harbor attack was clearly part of a conspiracy to drag the U.S. into the war led by President Roosevelt. In the post-war world, problems were explained by the communist conspiracy and the many communists in the federal government, exposed, of course, by Senator Joe McCarthy, who coined the phrase, a conspiracy so vast, that he used to describe State Department, U.S. Army, etc. Along with McCarthy, of course, was Roy Cohn, who became an advisor to Donald Trump and taught him in the ways of dealing with the law. In the South, the civil rights were denounced as by outside agitators and communists. The assassination of JFK spawned the Warren Report and an entire field of ever more implausible conspiracy theories. Right and left were attracted to conspiratorial explanation of events. The CIA, FBI, Trilateral Commission, the Bitburger Group, the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, all and more leading up to QAnon and associated current conspiracy groups and believers. Conspiracy theories on how and why the will of the people is being frustrated. There has always been just enough substance to some of these allegations and theories to feed new adherents and further convince those who already believe. There is a deep-seated idea that democracy is such a perfected system that any failings of it must be due to malign or outside influences of some sort. Paranoia is not just an individual condition, but can be a social and political phenomena as well. Conspiracy thinking overlaps with, but is not identical to populism, a tradition that best fits Trump, some of his key advisors, and many of his followers. One aspect of populism is that elites or the establishment disregards the will of the people, which of course is what brought some to Washington on the 6th. One specific element that fueled the protesters and mob is the constant and baseless allegations of widespread voter fraud, especially by the Democratic Party. It is constantly asserted, but never substantiated, that Cook County withheld its vote in 1960 presidential election until they knew how many votes JFK needed to carry Illinois and hence the presidency. This everybody knows that massive voter fraud takes place rhetoric needs to be put to bed or proved. Why do so many continue to believe in voter fraud with no evidence beyond single instances? It may be from too much overheated and irresponsible rhetoric. Obviously, we saw some from President Trump, but from both sides as well, and a reliance on social media. The media that drummed imminent civil war rhetoric should think about the impact of this as well as the truth of it. I will close with the observation that on January 6th, one of the justifications for the adoption and maintenance of the Electoral College was proven moot. The college did not insulate the outcome of a presidential election from the mob. Of course, the mob was not the urban and destitute of the framers' imaginings, but the suburban and substantial who asserted their disenfranchisement, but were not and are not able to demonstrate that widespread voter fraud occurred and brought them to Washington 2 weeks ago. So I'll conclude my remarks there and send it on to next. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. My remarks kind of continue from that background from Dr. Acsay. I want to briefly touch on the 2020 election and some of the factors that that I think contributed to the violent events at the Capitol on January 6th. So to start with the setting, for many years, our politics has been deeply and closely divided, that on many issues, probably most issues, Democrats and Republicans have serious disagreements about the right policy solutions. And our recent elections have tend to produce close outcomes. You can look at the composition of the US House and Senate right now and to see evidence of that. So that increases tension around our elections and other political conflicts. In addition, for many Americans, their partisanship has become closely intertwined with other parts of their identity, race, ethnicity, gender, where they live, their level of religious devotion, and so forth. And so the Democratic Party has increasingly become party of youth and racial and ethnic diversity. The Republican Party has increasingly become the party of white America. If you watched the inauguration yesterday, in part of President Biden's inaugural address, he criticized racists and extremists in America. Normally a non-controversial thing to say, but some Republicans have interpreted that as criticism of the Republican Party, right? This is where we are now as a nation. One consequence of these hardening partisan divisions is something we call negative partisanship. That is, people tend to be motivated more by their contempt for the political opposition than by affinity for their own side. People want to believe the worst about their opponents, and people tend to accept things that leaders on their own side of the political aisle say. And so when political leaders make unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud, they often find a receptive audience among their own partisans. So you can think of that as the setting, or think of that as the kindling. Next, we have other key players. There's a well-known political scientist named Adam Przeworski, who studied countries in Eastern Europe and South America, where for the last 80 or 90 years, they've shifted between democracy and authoritarian rule, so back and forth. And Przeworski describes democracy as, quote, a system in which parties lose elections, unquote. And for him, a crucial question is, how does the ruling party respond to an electoral defeat, right? Some political scientists refer to this as a Przeworski moment, sort of because this is something he studies, right? Does the governing party accept the election results and step aside for the newly elected party or coalition to take power? Or does the ruling party refuse to accept defeat, and instead does it, seek assistance from military or police forces or other levers of government to try and remain in power? We tend to take democracy for granted in the United States, right? We assume that it runs on autopilot, but we had our own Przeworski moment after the 2020 election, and President Trump behaved more like a dictator than as a leader who respects democracy. We probably knew this going in, right? The president has kind of a history of exaggerations. He made unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud in the 2016 election, an election that he won. But maybe we didn't expect maybe the degree to which he would refuse to accept the outcome of the 2020 election, the degree to which his campaign would challenge the election results in court, or the fact that the president himself would pressure state officials to try and overturn the election results in their own state. But nevertheless, you can think of President Trump maybe as the match or the spark, since many Americans listen to what he has to say. I think a third element is the reaction of other Republican leaders to the 2020 election. I think maybe this is the area where, as political scientists, we maybe didn't anticipate this as much, but many Republican politicians still refuse to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the presidential election. Many Republican politicians have made public statements or actions suggesting they too agree with President Trump that the election was somehow stolen. For Missouri residents, Senator Josh Hawley, right, has come in for some criticism for his role in objecting to the electoral vote counts in Arizona and Pennsylvania on January 6th. A somewhat more surprising example, I think, might be Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt. He wrote and filed a legal brief supporting a lawsuit to overturn the election results in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And all the Missouri Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives also supported that lawsuit. It may seem strange for a Missouri Attorney General to meddle in the election results in 4 other states, right? And his legal brief also offers an untested legal theory that non-legislative actors may not alter the election procedures in any state. So if the governor or the secretary of state or the state courts or local election officials change the voting procedures to cope with a raging pandemic, for example, that's somehow illegitimate and the presidential election results should be set aside in those states. I should add that Eric Schmidt's legal brief offered no evidence of voter fraud in the 2020 election in any of those 4 states. And the Supreme Court quickly dismissed that lawsuit, right? So you might say no harm, no foul, but there is harm. By filing that legal brief and by publicly stating that he had grave concerns about, quote, election integrity, our state attorney general intimated that he agrees with President Trump's unsubstantiated claims that somehow the election was stolen. And so I think the actions and statements of other Republican leaders acted as an accelerant in all this to sort of continue the fire metaphor. And so I think all those factors contributed to the violent events at the Capitol on January 6th.
Okay, so my colleagues here have laid a lot of context for why this has happened, how it's happened in other places in our history, and what some of the theories are. So I'm briefly going to talk about some of the aftermath and impacts that this insurrection or mob violence, or however you want to term it, has had. Immediately that night, we did see a number of senators who had planned on objecting to electoral college votes decide to go ahead and rescind those objections and support the electoral college vote. So there were some senators that made that change in light of the insurrection at the Capitol. However, for example, the Pennsylvania electoral college votes, 7 senators still objected to that after this violence had happened, and 138 members of the House objected to those certifying those electoral college votes. Among Missouri's delegation, the only Republicans in Congress from Missouri who did not support those objections were Roy Blunt and Ann Wagner. But, you know, we've heard a lot of talk about Josh Hawley, but all of the other representatives from Missouri also objected to that, except for Ann Wagner. But in the end, the electoral college votes were certified. And that night, actually next morning, you could say, Joe Biden was declared the president-elect. In the aftermath, we saw President Trump's social media account suspended, and now there's a lot of debate over First Amendment and, you know, Section 230 and how should we handle social media. But that was one of the immediate effects for insurrection or for incitement of violence. And it wasn't just President Trump; a number of other social media accounts were shut down in light of those events. Parler, which you might have heard of, is a more alternative social media site, a lot of alt-right and other activity going on there. And a lot of people had been transitioning over to that. But then based on the actions by Amazon, which suspended the company's hosting services, and Google and Apple removing it from their app stores, Parler basically was taken down. They are still working to get that up. I think they have like a work in progress website now, but trying to get hosting services for that. So these are some pretty big impacts right away. Taking action on social media, many would argue that action should have been taken earlier, and I think we'll discuss that more in the Q&A. There have also been FBI investigations, and so far about 125 arrests, which many people think is not nearly enough based on what happened, but they say that they're continuing to work on that and many more arrests will happen. And, you know, it's interesting when you look at the arrests, there were all these sort of conspiracy theories immediately popping up on January 6th that this was Antifa, these were, you know, other people posing as Trump supporters. And it's been pretty clear as we've seen who's arrested that these were people who were adherents to QAnon conspiracy theories, who were parts of these far-right extremist groups, and who did believe that they were acting in support of President Trump and what was his rightful election results. We also have seen a big move with donors withdrawing funds. So for the lawmakers who oppose certification of the presidential election, they have lost the support of their 20 largest corporate backers. We've definitely seen in Missouri, Josh Hawley lose his 2 largest backers and being renounced by his mentor, Senator Danforth. So that has been backlash that he has suffered, but a lot of the Republicans who objected to the election results have also suffered similar setbacks. Josh Hawley, you know, his book deal was pulled, which of course he's finding other outlets for it. And then we've seen a militarized DC. I'm sure a lot of you watched the inauguration yesterday, which would have been pared down because of the pandemic regardless. But we had more troops in DC than we had folks there for the inauguration. It's a very different militarized environment that we've seen in response to this. Also, we've seen St. Louis Representative Cori Bush make her legislative debut by introducing a resolution that recommends expelling members who sought to overturn the election. So far, I believe there's 47 co-sponsors on that, all Democrats, but they specifically call out Representative Mo Brooks, Josh Hawley, and Senator Hawley and Senator Cruz, and saying that they took unprecedented steps to defy the will of the people. Now, will they be expelled from Congress with a 2/3 vote? Most likely not, but these are the conversations that are happening. Obviously, President Trump was impeached very quickly in the aftermath of this. So that was another consequence that came from this action on January 6th. And then we've seen a big division in the Republican Party. You could say it was simmering underneath for the past 4 years, but it seems that for many Republicans that this was the thing that it took for them to break their loyalty with Donald Trump. Also, the fact that he was leaving office in 2 weeks and didn't have a Twitter account might have emboldened some people, thinking that his power to leverage over them might have been diminished. But we have seen some fissures. We've seen Liz Cheney supporting impeachment. We've seen Mitch McConnell coming out. If you saw how he talked about impeachment the first time when he explicitly said, "I am not an impartial juror," he very clearly opposed the first impeachment, a very different tone this time. And so in the Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, Mitt Romney voted yes for one article of impeachment, and no other Republican did. We've already seen in the House impeachment, 10 Republicans vote in favor of impeachment, and we don't know how the Senate trial will go, but a number of senators saying that they would support that. So that's a very different change. We've also seen Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, while he did not support impeachment, he is saying that he would be open to a censure or something else. And it's not just President Trump who's facing this backlash. Like I mentioned, there are motions for senators and representatives to have censure, reprimand, or even expulsion. So these are all things that we're facing in the wake of the actions of January 6th. So that's a lot that's happened in just a couple weeks. I don't want to take too much more time because I know we have a lot of Q&A to get to, and a lot of what I would talk about is probably in there. So Joe, I'll turn it back over to you for now.
Yeah, thank you very much to all 4 of you for that description of everything that has taken place. So we're now going to get into the Q&A section. And I just want to thank everybody that submitted questions beforehand. So we have a few of these we want to get right into. So we'll start off. This first question, I think we touched on a little bit. A few of you did in your descriptions here, but I just kind of want to ask this still just to get some more thoughts. So what are the origins of the group that stormed the Capitol? Are the group of Trump loyalists connected to any conservative movements of the past? And why does the group insist that the election was fraudulent despite evidence that proves otherwise?
Well, I would say that this sort of Stop the Steal movement was a large part of that rally and the coalition that ended up storming the Capitol. That a lot of that took place, that organizing took place on social media right after the election. The Stop the Steal hashtag and groups were formed. And you saw people from QAnon conspiracists to Tea Party supporters to mainstream Republicans to QAnon, the far-right militia groups, neo-Nazis, all kind of coalescing around this. And so while some people, thought they were taking buses to exercise their First Amendment rights in a protest in the nation's capital, other people had been plotting violence for this well in advance. So I would say that it was a broad coalition, but a common thread seems to be that they thought the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And I'll turn over my other panelists.
I'll just add unfortunately, the way public opinion works is, hard evidence or the absence of evidence isn't always the most persuasive thing for the American public. That a compelling narrative, and particularly a compelling slogan like "Stop the Steal," can often be more persuasive than actual, legal evidence. And as Dr. Acsay mentioned, there have been claims of voter fraud in the American election. Even unsubstantiated claims go back a long ways and predate President Trump. So there's been a kind of voter fraud narrative, often not supported by evidence that's been part of the American political discourse for many years.
I'll piggyback on that a little bit and just emphasize that this was a coalition of a broad number of groups, some of which certainly intended to peacefully protest based on largely conspiracy theories about election fraud, others that did plan for violence, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, and a number of other far-right militias that are active year-round, all the time. But I think if we really look, the Oath Keepers are a big nationwide network that a lot of these other far-right militias will actually even pay dues to keep an affiliation with and to help with organization and training. So there's certainly a very identifiable one. And then, in terms of the election fraud, if I'm not mistaken, one of the only recent cases of documented election fraud was in North Carolina, and it was actually Republican operatives that were using mail-in ballots, fraudulently, I think, filling out mail-in ballots and then submitting them. So it's a little bit, it's very hypocritical, but it's certainly a little bit ironic that that seems to be the side that chants fraud the loudest.
And I would add too, when it comes to the Oath Keepers, the FBI has identified that they focus on recruiting current and former military, law enforcement, and first responders, which was some of the concern that was popping up in this last week as well.
So I think we can go ahead and move on to our next question then. So our next question is, how did social media play a part in the events that occurred? Has social media also played a part in the current political climate we are in?
Who wants to start on this one?
I'm not a tech or social media expert, but I do know that social media works off of algorithms, and they tend to feed you information that you've liked and avoid information that you've disliked. Some platforms are better or worse, depending on your perspective, at sort of insulating you in a little bubble based on their algorithms. And that's a big problem because it's very easy to go from, I hate Democrats to, white nationalist conspiracy theories. If you're just getting into that feedback loop, because the more you like things that the white nationalists have liked, the more you're going to start seeing their content as well. So it's social media makes it a lot easier to spread misinformation and bad information. And I think that that's the main role that it played, is inoculating people in these little bubbles that is really easy to just drop conspiracy theories in and get them to buy in.
Right. I would just build on that by saying, I think there's pretty clear evidence that people are being radicalized on social media. I think that's a fair term to use in the circumstance. And that the riot that happened on January 6th was openly planned online for weeks following the election, that these conspiracy theories were online, that these groups were planning online. I saw that at least 128,000 Facebook users had hashtags with Stop the Steal and detailed maps of the Capitol. Some of the language that was being used, like burn down DC, who's running the arms and ammo, talking about we want blood, and calling on people to murder Nancy Pelosi. So this language was all out there in the open. And that's, again, part of the backlash that social media organizations are getting now. They're getting it from conservatives and liberals, two different perspectives of how they should be doing their job. So there's definitely a lot of scrutiny happening there, and we'll see what the new Congress and the new presidential administration, if they try to move on some kind of regulation around tech industries in response.
So if we don't have more thoughts on that, I think we could go on to the next question. So for our third question, how is it possible for the Capitol building to be breached given the level of security it has?
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I don't understand it. And this is what part of the investigation will have to determine. I did see the statement the day after by the resigned chief, Capitol Police chief, who seemed to argue that he knew at least some of the coming problems and was not supported. Now, all this will have to come out with documentary evidence about what he said, when he said it. He claimed the Pentagon was blocking, but the DC police, one would assume, would have been involved earlier. In my experience, and from my point of view, being my age, I remember, well, not Coxey's Army, 1893, but they were arrested for stepping on the grass at the White House. Of course, the bonus marchers were burned out of Anacostia Flats when they simply were in Washington, D.C. in 32. And in the Vietnam moratorium, they had 50 caliber machine guns with live rounds on the Capitol steps. So they certainly in the past had prepared for all sorts of challenges to the building. To me, it's just not understandable. I hope maybe some of the political scientists have some more insight than this.
I don't have a good answer. And I think that's something that a lot of us will be interested to know after further investigation.
Certainly, for whatever reasons, it seems like clearly a different approach was taken to this protest than to Black Lives Matter and other protests that were held in the Capitol.
I think it's pretty clear that there was either widespread incompetence or some coordination or collusion, and we're likely to see evidence of one or the other in the coming months.
So moving on to the next question. Do you believe Trump will be convicted in the Senate? If he is not, can he still be charged or sued for his actions now that he is out of the White House? If he is convicted, would he then be prohibited from ever holding an elected office in government? And I also want to add on, as I saw in the chat, if you could also talk about the timeline for the Senate trial, given with Senator McConnell wanting to delay it to a later date. If you could talk about that as well in your answers.
So raise your hand if you think that Trump will be convicted in the Senate. It looks like that's a no. It would take 17 Republicans crossing over to vote against him. I think, 10 days ago, I said, no way. Now I still wouldn't put my money on it. That's a lot of defections that would have to happen. So to answer the first part, it seems like we're not very convinced that Trump will be convicted in the Senate. The next part is, can he still be charged or sued for his actions now that he's out of the White House? Yes. And there are state investigations going on, civil lawsuits. So he has probably a lot of prosecutions ahead of him or lawsuits. So I'll pause there and let someone else take over.
Yeah, I think I'll just add on the Senate. I think the person to watch is Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader. His statement the other day suggested that maybe he's open to supporting conviction, and if he does, then other Republican senators might follow suit. If he doesn't, then I wouldn't expect many other Republican leaders to do that. He's seen as sort of the chief political strategist among Republican senators. I haven't seen his statement, Senator McConnell's statement today about delaying the impeachment trial, at least now that President Trump is no longer president. Whether the trial is next week or next month, I don't think is maybe as urgent. And I can at least see the argument that at least there's more pressing business now to hold confirmation hearings for President Biden's nominees for cabinet level positions, to maybe do that first. Anyway. And if convicted, President Trump would be barred from running for president again, but would still receive his pension and sort of other post-presidential benefits, if you will.
If we have no more thoughts on that, we can move on to our next question. Do you believe that the events of January 6th were an inflection point for the United States, or do you believe it only further emboldened those who seek to disrupt the political systems in America?
I initially viewed it as kind of an inflection point. I thought seeing how weak the response was on January 6th and how easy it was, we were incredibly likely to see lots of similar events on Inauguration Day, either at state capitals, which also several of which felt under assault on January 6th. And maybe it's because of exactly how well the response was clearly demonstrated beforehand that we didn't see that. But there were only a couple of arrests that have come out publicly about anybody even trying anything on Inauguration Day. So maybe more comes out and there were more widespread attempts to cause violence and damage the political system. But from a political violence standpoint, I don't think US politics have become sort of permanently more violent. We might see some more in the short term, but I don't think that we're likely to see this become a permanent feature in American politics.
I think it's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think, as my opening remarks suggested, I think it really depends on what the leaders of the Republican Party decide to do moving forward, whether they decide to try and turn the page and move on and prevent Trumpism from returning as a key part of the political party, or not. I mean, I think that's a key part in answering that question, and I don't know how that's going to go.
I have to wonder, I did look up a polling data. You guys are probably more familiar with me with this stuff, but the last one, 34% still thought Trump did a good job. And this was after the 6th. To me, that suggests there's a 1/3 of the American electorate that can completely overlook his fiery rhetoric and in the speeches and the lies. So that to me is not they're not armed, they're not traveling, but it's problematic to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually had a slide that I meant to share earlier, and I'll just share it now. When we talk about how different political parties might frame this and shape this in the time to come, this is from January 6th to 10th, how Democrats and Republicans talked about what happened on Facebook and Twitter. So what terms did they use? In 73% of Democrats' posts, they used the words insurrection, 95% had Trump, 94% had democracy, 90% had violence. And you can see that there was a big difference here. That's the Democrat differential. And then here, most of the posts made by Republicans focused on law enforcement. That was their biggest differential. So how we talk about this, how we continue to frame it and think about it, I think matters, if it is condemned or if it is supported. We saw in Missouri, for example, Josh Hawley come out much more strongly with his language about the small protest that happened outside his home near DC and about his book deal, and much less about the actual violence that happened at the Capitol. So how leaders talk about it will matter. We have also seen as a repercussion that 93% of Republican members with a Twitter account had a loss in Twitter followers. And that time, this is say January 6th, not January 60th through 10th, median loss of 4% of followers. That also was a time that 70,000 Twitter accounts were taken down for violence and conspiracy theories and the like. In that same time, we saw Democrats have a net increase over followers in that period. So will public response nudge politicians to speak about things differently or handle things differently? Will donor funding nudge those politicians? So I think that all has a role to play in how we move forward.
So the next question we had sent in was, how can we move past this as a country? What steps need to be taken in order to reestablish trust in our democratic processes?
The first thing that came to my mind here was transitional justice, which is a term that sometimes will trigger people and immediately think we're talking about reparations, but that's not all transitional justice is. Transitional justice is all about restoring the rule of law, which means that we have to hold the people who incited this and committed this violence accountable in some way, shape, or form. We have to make access to justice a reality for people in society who are especially vulnerable in the aftermath of violations. We have to ensure that there's sort of a durable resolution of conflicts, which means that there's some efforts made to keep people from feeling disenfranchised or that they're being left behind by the political system. And we have to, further advance the cause of reconciliation, which is going to involve reaching out to both the people who are causing this, who are committing these acts, and the people who are often targeted by these acts, and trying to figure out a way to move forward.
That's another great question. I don't think I have all the solutions, but at least I think for me, one important step forward is, as Senator Mitt Romney said on January 6th, that you show respect for the American people by telling them the truth. And the truth is Joe Biden won the presidential election of 2020 fair and square. And I think if more political leaders would say that unequivocally, that would certainly help.
I mean, I think that's one of the unfortunate parts of President Trump never conceding or taking part in the inauguration and making even those symbolic gestures to acknowledge free and fair election and a peaceful transition of power. I think had he done that, that would have probably went a long way.
Yeah, I should add, if Republican leaders truly believe voter fraud influence the presidential election, then they have an obligation to provide real evidence that it happened on a big scale, to influence tens of thousands of votes in some of those swing states, for example.
The same thing, as we mentioned, was alleged in 2016, and Trump did have a voter fraud committee that came up with zero evidence of widespread voter fraud.
So our next question that we had, what does the future hold for the Republican Party? Will they attempt to separate themselves from the Trump era and that brand of politics?
Okay, I'll go first. I mean, I've talked about this a bit already. This is something I taught an elections course last semester, and this is something we discussed with the students. I mean, I think, if you came here from Mars and saw the election results, or from another country, and up and down the ticket, Congress, Republicans gained seats in the House. Governorships and other statewide offices, Republicans made gains there. State legislatures around the country, Republicans gained a net of over 100 seats nationwide. President, Republicans lost ground. That's the one, look up and down the ticket. Presidency is the one area of government where Republicans did poorly compared to the rest of the ballot, right? A rational person might say, okay, solution's easy. Republican Party needs to move on from Trump, find a new presidential candidate to lead the ticket in 2024. But it's not that simple. That I think for a lot of Republican strategists and politicians, it's become pretty clear that they win elections, or at least closely contested elections, they win with support from traditional conservative voters, plus the base that Trump mobilizes, particularly white Americans with less than a college education, and that to move on from Trump, to drop Trump, means they lose part of that coalition that helps them win elections. And so I'd say absent polling data, like Dr. Acsay mentioned, absent polling data showing President Trump is now radioactive and is approved by less than 30% of Americans, they might not, they might not move on or try to cut Donald Trump off of their political coalition.
So we have one more question from the sent-in questions. So how will the events that occurred affect the beginning of the Biden administration? I want to add in what initiatives can the administration implement in order to engage with Americans that might have been had disdain for the results or showed unrest as a result of the election.
Well, it seems to me the Biden administration has made their top priority COVID, and they put forth a big proposal that, is a proposal that had that odd coalition of Josh Hawley, Donald Trump, and Bernie Sanders supporting the $2,000 payment. So that bill would support the additional $1,400 from the $600 that went out before, and could be something that extends unemployment benefits and does other things that might reach a large coalition of people. But then the other proposal he's put out is an immigration proposal, which would probably be very unpopular with those folks who were at the Capitol on the 6th. So, it will be interesting to see how those different proposals affect different people. We heard President Biden talking a lot about unity and about disenfranchised voters and his experience, growing up and knowing what it's like to not pay bills and to lose a job, those sorts of things. But, I think economic issues might be where he can bolster some of that coalition. I have also heard reporting that on the QAnon side that there's been a lot of disappointed chatter and people who feel disenfranchised because sort of what they thought would happen didn't happen. But like Peter pointed out, folks don't just abscond from conspiracy theories. These morph into other things and change. So while some people might be distancing themselves to that, it will tend to morph into other ideas. And that seems to be what's happening there too.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that typically the first 100 days of a new president's term is moving quickly or trying to move quickly on some major policy initiatives. And an impeachment trial typically takes weeks in the Senate. And so that would clearly take time away from that sort of first 100 days of moving on a new legislative agenda for a president.
Yeah, and when we talked about McConnell wanting to delay that, I get the feeling that Biden wouldn't mind delaying that impeachment trial either.
Oh, can I ask the panel something about Schumer as a Senate leader? I mean, I know who he is, but insight into how he operates, what he does, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Chuck Schumer is a senator from New York. He's been in the Senate now since the late 90s, and he's been the Democratic leader for last 6-8 years, I think, since Harry Reid left. I mean, yeah, he has a reputation, being from a senator from New York, has a reputation of a fairly liberal Democrat, but he's never had the position of majority leader before. And so I think, I'd say he's kind of untested in that position. And it's a very challenging position to be in with a 50-50 Senate. I mean, it's going to be difficult circumstances to get major legislation passed, absent, without cooperation from a lot of Republican senators.
It seems to me as minority leader, he and Nancy Pelosi coordinated a lot and have come out very much in unison in a number of things. So I would expect to see that continued coordination too.
So before we go here, for the last couple minutes, I just wanted to give each of you, if any of you want to, just the last chance to address anything you saw come up in the chat or Q&A at all, or just any last thoughts you have on this topic before we go.
I might just quickly say from history side, a lot of the rhetoric was overheated, not just the Trump supporters rhetoric, but the rhetoric of the, I don't know what to call it, MSNBC, CNN sort of thing. Looking at history, not just the United States, but other countries, there has been much worse, more dangerous, more threatening events. It doesn't mean that it can be easily ignored, but it means that it can be saved, brought back together, stitched out. But the problem is I don't know how to reach the disaffected. This is a worldwide problem with the voters right now. You'll go to Brazil, go to Hungary, go wherever you want, Philippines, and look at Brexit. It's people feeling that the unresponsive political system, they're disenfranchised, even if they're not disenfranchised directly, economically, they're threatened. That's a big thing to address. Biden, whomever addresses it, that I would hope there would be some sort of worldwide effort to deal with the disaffection that so-called globalism has, and it's a right and left phenomenon, as I'm sure you're aware, that it's interesting when both sides are equally against the thing that they call globalization, that again is hard to define and get your hands on. But while it is a somewhat scary time, I do believe that leadership is the way out of it, and of course that each individual has responsibility to act responsibly themselves. So that's what I would hope to.
I'm going to jump in and close by just recognizing two questions from the chat. One from Matthew Taylor and one from Blaine Milligan. There really is a deep-seated thread in the people that showed up and committed the violence at the rally of a white nationalist or white supremacist ideology. I think that's very clear, whether that is you know, an outright explicit justification of their ideology or something that's just sort of implicit. I think it's very fair to say that the people who both were hardcore objecting to the votes, if you look at the votes they were objecting to, they were primarily votes from areas with predominantly people of color. And I don't think you can look at all of those things as purely a coincidence. Moving on to Blaine's question, how do you find the balance between understanding the importance of the insurrection that occurred on the 6th, but not falling into the mentality that the sky is falling or we're on the verge of civil war? That can be very difficult. But I think it's important to note that this ultimately was one really, really bad day that was preceded in history by a number of other incidences. But we're not, there are very few people calling for outright civil war. If we look at the levels of mobilization, we tend to think of people ideologically falling on sort of a normal distribution, a bell curve, and really only like the 2.5% on one tail end and 2.5% on the other tail end are ever ready to take up arms against each other. In a country of 300 million people, 2.5% on either side can sound like an awful lot, but it's important to remember that about 95% of people would have really no interest in taking up arms and going to civil war. Your neighbors are still your neighbors. The people that you, at least pre-pandemic, would go and grab a drink with or go and get lunch with are still the people that you would do that with. It's tough to balance. It's tough to keep that perspective in mind, but it is important to keep that perspective in mind.
I would add to this, it was one day, and I think it's important to keep that perspective in mind, but it had been building for quite some time, right? And as we discussed before, the signs were there, the rhetoric was there from different leaders, from different far-right groups. It was there on discussion boards and such. So I think that it's important. And, you know, the FBI and others have come forward and said that domestic terrorism is a major concern in this country, and white supremacy and extremist groups. So I think that it is important that we realize that this problem isn't just going to go away, that we have to find ways to deal with it. And like I mentioned earlier, there's lots of controversy over how it should be handled with social media. What's the best thing? You know, when they tried to move sex trafficking issues off of Craigslist and others, they went darker and deeper, and that created unintended consequences. So like, what could happen with different regulation of social media? We don't know that. I think that's going to be debated in the upcoming weeks and months. But I think that we also need to, and this is hard, I don't know the answer to this, but how do we talk to each other? How do we hear each other and hear different perspectives? There are some perspectives and some facts, like we've discussed today, that are just facts. You don't have an opinion, you know, there's not an opinion around if the election was free and fair. It was, that's a fact. But there are other things and perspectives that we don't understand how people who have different experiences from us are feeling. And I think we need to continue to foster those conversations, understand each other, and find some common ground. I think there is common ground around some economic issues. I think, like Peter said, there might be common ground around some trade issues and other things. So where can we find that common ground in areas where we can move forward?
Yeah, so I guess my final thoughts are that the political divisions that I mentioned in the opening remarks among the mass public still remain, and those will continue with us. And I think it will take political leadership to try and bridge those differences, and that'll be a big challenge.
So I just want to thank again everybody who submitted questions beforehand, everyone that attended today, and as well as our panelists. I think this is a very informative discussion, and I'm glad we could do this. I just want to remind people that we did record this, so we'll have it up on our student government website, and I believe some of the departments will have it up on their website as well. So be sure to send an email about that. But once again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.